CPI Case 392, The Papyrus Phenomena. Attending investigators, Ernest Brundle, Dorothy Blakely, Bartholomew Jackson. Reference, CPI Case 391, Potter's Infirmary. Conclusion, Mr. Hedge, proprietor of Hedge Holdings, had recently acquired the old and disused infirmary at Potter's End with clandestine plans to develop the building into, apparently, some kind of laboratory. He had employed a pair of destitute locals to undertake various nefarious activities in order to convince the other villagers that the building was haunted, ensuring a level of seclusion that would allow Mr. Hedge to continue with his plans. What follows is an account of the happenings immediately after Mr. Hedge and his two reprobates had been taken away by the local constabulary. Having seen to what was presumed to be the successful conclusion of the matter at Potter's End, with those responsible taken under the care of the local constabulary, it was only when one of those involved had advised Mr. Ernest Brundle, chief investigator for the Committee of Psychical Research, to check what was hidden under rags and such, over in the corner of the courtyard, that the matter took on a wholly different complexion. "Come and give me a hand, will you?" Ernest asked his young colleague, Mr. Bartholomew Jackson, and together they made their way through the building and out to the courtyard. "Over there," Bartholomew wondered, pointing to the far corner of the area, and then, with Ernest following, he walked across to the pile of rags and sacks that were bundled against the wall, spread a few feet across the broken stonework of the yard. At first the mound seemed as though it had been caught on something as Bartholomew tugged at it, but then, with a more forceful pull, the textiles at last came away, revealing what appeared to be a heavy wooden trapdoor hidden beneath, sunken into the paving. "What the dickens?" Ernest said, crouching closer and wrinkling his nose. "I say, do you smell that?" Bartholomew nodded sharply and covered his mouth. It was an odor not unlike something rotten, a putrid combination of neglected fruit and mothballs, and it even gave cause for the far more experienced Ernest to get to his feet and back away for a moment. Bartholomew turned, trying to find something with which to open the hatch, and then, spotting a narrow length of broken pipe a few feet across from them, he collected it and began inserting it along the edges of the hatch as he tried to force it open. Eventually the square of wood shifted, and Bartholomew was able to raise it from its position, the stench increasing as the old, stale air rushed from below. Ernest leaned forward, and through the gloom was able to see the beginning of a tight set of steps, disappearing into the darkness below. Just then, appearing at the far side of the courtyard and causing both of them to shudder in surprise, CPI partner Ms. Dorothy Blakely called across to them. "Well, Carl's gone with most of the equipment. Shall we take ourselves off for a spot of lunch?" "Goodness, Dorothy," Ernest said, looking over to her, "you almost had me down the hole." "What on earth are you two doing?" she asked, smiling as she approached. "Must all boys be so desperate to get themselves absolutely covered in grime?" And then, as she reached them, she covered her nose and said, somewhat less cheerfully, "Heavens, what have you done now? Was it the prunes you had earlier?" "No, no," Ernest assured her. "It's not us. I mean to say, I didn't even have any—" Dorothy's laughter cut him off before he cleared his throat and continued, "It's actually coming from down there." She looked over the edge of the opening and then, glancing from Ernest to Bartholomew and back again, asked, "Do you think this is what that chap was referring to? The real reason Hedge was so determined to keep everyone away from here, so who's going down first?" "I'll do it," Bartholomew quickly answered, swinging his legs into the hole and stamping on the first step. "Seems solid enough," he shrugged, before adjusting his body so he could begin his descent. Both impressed with and concerned by the young man's impetuousness, Ernest watched as Bartholomew disappeared into the obscurity below them. When he had lost sight of him, he called out to ask what he could see down there. "Bartholomew," Dorothy called when he didn't reply. They waited several more seconds, and then Ernest called his name, but still there was no answer. "You'll just have to go down there too," Dorothy said, nudging her elbow into Ernest's side. Ernest nodded, looked once more into the hole, and then, not without some effort and a groan or two, he maneuvered his body so that he too could place his feet squarely on the first step. As he went down, slowly and carefully, the light diminishing with every step, he felt the cold roughness of the stone walls, the narrowness of the opening forcing his shoulders to rub and scratch against the uneven surface. The tightness did not relinquish its grip until he had taken several more steps, and now concealed within an almost complete darkness, he realized he was at the bottom and that, turning cautiously, he had reached what seemed to be a rather low tunnel or passage of some kind. "Bartholomew," he said into the pitch, the air already dank and filthy in his throat. The shaft returned his voice as a quiet echo, but there was no reply from his colleague. He tried again, but still there came nothing other than the peculiar recurrence of himself that this time sounded oddly different, as though it was no longer his own voice at all. He looked back, up the steps, and was surprised at just how far away the daylight now was. Nothing more was visible than a small square, at a much greater distance from him than he thought it should be, and he could no longer see Dorothy nor any further along the steps than the bottom 2 or 3. As he stood looking upwards, a gush of chilled air came along the tunnel at a considerable speed, and shivering, he turned to see whether he could find any reason for it. If anything, it now seemed even more opaque than it had previously been, and, still having received no affirmation of Bartholomew's position, he decided that the only thing he could do was to move forward so that he might find his colleague. And so, his hands tracing the rough, freezing walls at either side, he walked into the darkness as it closed around him. He had no way of knowing how far he would need to go in order to find an end, or even a turning, and no idea where Bartholomew could be. Eventually, after what could have been either a few minutes or half an hour, his grasp of time and space having now strangely abandoned him in the liminality, he thought he could see a very dim and flickering orange-yellow light further along the passage. "Bartholomew," he said, though this time it was more a whisper than a call. "Bartholomew, is that you up there?" Something, he was sure, shifted in the darkness behind him, and the insidious feeling crept over him that he was no longer alone. He knew there was no use in looking back, since he could barely make out his own hands, now dirty and uncomfortable with scratches and cobwebs, and so there would be no chance of him seeing anything in the gloom to his rear. Instead, his head slightly cocked, listening intently but hearing nothing more behind, he increased his pace towards the light that thankfully was now growing larger and more clear. It was, he guessed, the dancing flame of a candle cast into the tunnel from what must be a recess or a turn to the left. Coming closer to the light, he could see at last that there was a turning, the rough surface of the tunnel wall now more obvious ahead of him. Reaching a hand to find the edge, he brought himself to the corner and guardedly moved his head to peer towards the light. He found a large area, perhaps 20 feet square, candles affixed in alcoves, placed at regular intervals along the walls, while, at the far side, there seemed to be another tunnel that fell immediately into darkness. Beneath the rows of candles, he found a number of large cardboard boxes, the dust and cobwebs that clung to each of them suggesting they had been there, untouched, for some time. As he moved around the room, he also saw a small desk, close to where he had entered, and upon that he found several notebooks and papers that were all in a similar condition to the boxes, as well as a few glass items that appeared to be test tubes or the like. Picking up one of the notebooks, and then, for a moment, pausing as he thought he heard another sound from the tunnel, he was just raising the jotter towards one of the candles for a better view of its contents when he heard something else, something from the other side of the room, from the passageway he had not yet investigated. Yes, definitely sounds, like something moving quickly along the tunnel, growing louder, getting closer. Ernest tugged at the candle, releasing it from its rudimentary sconce, and then holding it out in front of him so that it would serve as not only illumination, but also, if necessary, as at least some form of defense, should it be required. He could do nothing to stop the shaking of his hand as he waited for whatever it might be that was surely now only a matter of inches away from coming into the room. And then, "Gee whiskers," hissed Bartholomew, "you scared the tickets out of me, man." "Bartholomew," Ernest said, a little more unsteadily, moving the candle aside for a better view. "Glad you're here too, I must say," Bartholomew replied, still speaking quietly. "Fair knocked me upstairs, being down here on me Todd." Ernest, quickly recovering his composure, lowered the candle and took a few deep breaths before asking, "What on earth do you think this is?" "Shh," Bartholomew said. "You've not nearly seen the half of it yet. I was just coming to get you from the courtyard, but now you're here, you must come along and have a look through here. And might I suggest, You bring the candle with you. Walked straight into the wall more than once, I did, and I don't mind admitting it. Why are you whispering? Ernest asked, his own voice now lower, as Bartholomew disappeared around the corner and into the other tunnel. Wondering what it could possibly be that was so significant, Ernest, candle in hand, followed the young man and found himself in the confines of another, slightly wider tunnel. Bartholomew had already moved so far ahead that he was almost out of sight, and still, as he moved forward, Ernest could not escape the sensation that there was something following somewhere behind him. He reached the end of the tunnel, turned the corner, and this time the room he found himself in was both smaller and darker than the first. The candle he had managed to keep aglow still the only source of light, and strangely, even though there was no obvious sign of any point of egress, there was also no sign of Bartholomew. Ernest whispered the young man's name into the dimness, at the same time turning slowly, allowing the light from the candle to pick out the empty corners of the room. "Where did you go, Bartholomew?" Then something nearby began to move, something that sounded solid and heavy, slowly scraping across the floor. "Hello there," Bartholomew said, rather more frivolously than Ernest considered appropriate. Twisting so he could see where he was, Ernest was amazed to find Bartholomew standing at the other side of the room, the wall apparently incorporating a secret doorway that seemed to open into another area beyond. Still grinning, Bartholomew explained that when he had entered the room, he'd needed to lean against the wall in order to see what he had caught in the sole of his shoe, and as he pressed against it, the wall started to give way, revealing its concealed access. "It goes down quite a way," he went on, "down these steps, and then, well, you just come along and see." "Why are you no longer whispering?" Ernest asked softly. "Oh, well, I just thought it might add to the atmosphere earlier," Bartholomew replied, smiling before flicking his cigarette lighter into life and starting down the steps. Shaking his head, but at the same time also smiling, Ernest followed him down the sloping passageway of stone steps, and when he reached the bottom, he could barely believe what he was seeing. The area in which they were now standing was enormous, split into two chambers that seemed as though they were almost as large as the infirmary above. All around the edges of this first space were tables and desks, covered with papers and books, test tubes and bell jars, long glass pipes and Bunsen burners. Where it met the second, there appeared to be time-worn stone pillars reaching from floor to ceiling and what looked like Egyptian hieroglyphics daubed onto the walls. "Is this Hedges' laboratory?" Ernest asked, slowly walking by the equipment, lighting the candles that were fixed to the walls as he went. Bartholomew did not reply, and so, wondering where he had got to this time, Ernest looked around and gasped as the light from his candle caught several objects farther away. In the middle of the second chamber he had not previously been able to see. There were coffins, rather large and very old coffins. "Sweet banana sundae," Ernest exclaimed, approaching one of them. "What the Delilah is all this about?" "Pharaohs," Bartholomew said, quite matter-of-factly, appearing from the shadows with some papers in his hand and blowing out the flame of his lighter. "Seems like our Mr. Hedge somehow managed to get his hands on a set of sarcophagi and their resident mummies." "Mummies?" Ernest replied incredulously. "Sarcophagi?" "Says here," Bartholomew continued, shaking the papers, "that Hedge knew someone who knew someone else, you know how these things are, who was an acquaintance of that Carter chap, the one who was in all the newspapers after he discovered those Egyptian tombs a few years ago." "Really?" Ernest asked, astounded, walking slowly into the second part of the basement, eyeing the engravings on the pillars and then closely examining one of the caskets. "Indeed," Bartholomew continued, gesturing towards the sarcophagi, "and through some dealings or other, the odd few backhanders and other shady do-Hannigans, I should wager, it seems Hedge managed to get his dirty paws on these four fellows." "But why?" Ernest asked. "I mean to say, he didn't strike me as the sort of chap with any great degree of interest in Middle Eastern antiquities." "It's all about the curses, or at least I read something about that in here," Bartholomew replied, placing a few sheets of paper on the lid of one of the coffins. Ernest now saw that the papers were, in fact, rather old sheets of papyrus covered with writing and drawings. He moved back to one of the desks in the first chamber, lighted the candle above it, and began reading. When he was finished, he explained to Bartholomew that Mr. Hedge had apparently been told that sealed sarcophagi recovered from Egyptian tombs carried with them a dreadful curse, and that, should one be able to concoct various chemical combinations, he would be able to harness its power and use it to his own wicked ends. So that's what all these test tubes and what have you are all about? Bartholomew asked. But what did Hedge have in mind? What was he planning to do, even if all this curse business was in fact possible? He coughed and glanced over his shoulder timidly. Ernest watched him, and feeling as though he was waiting for him to speak, Bartholomew added with a weak laugh, "That is, of course, should one be dim-witted enough to believe in such things." "Yes, well," Ernest said, sounding slightly disbelieving as he looked Bartholomew up and down. "Quite. But you do pose the obvious question. Just what was Mr. Hedge up to down here?" Deciding the answer might be hidden amongst the other papers and notebooks, the pair searched for almost an hour until finally Bartholomew found something. "Now, it says here," he reported, "that it apparently is the mixing of a few of these things listed here, all of which I shan't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce since they all end in things like iodane and amantane, that can be used to raise the dead and take ownership of the curse. So, you had it on the nose. It's supposedly all to do with this science business." As he listened, Ernest again began to get the eerie impression that the two of them were not alone. Having previously lighted the majority of the candles that ran along the walls on either side of the first chamber, he was able to see almost all the way to the far end of the second. And as he looked, he was sure he could see something happening, that there was some kind of gathering darkness similar to a thickening cloud of blackened smoke. Bartholomew too noticed the solidifying smoulders, and first looking across to Ernest, his brow furrowed with thought, he then started along the room. "What are you doing?" Ernest hissed. Bartholomew did not reply as he continued towards the dark mass, and then, as the dense smog grew yet larger, almost smothering him entirely, he raised his hands, all the while looking at the sheet of papyrus now held above his head. And then, as Ernest looked on in astonishment, he began to read, slowly and carefully, his voice louder and more serious, reciting a series of words Ernest could not understand. At that, the dark cloud quickly grew much larger, all of the candles were extinguished, a low booming sound echoed violently for several seconds through the basement, and then, in the subsequent gloom, there fell a heavy and complete silence, a stillness so deep that for a time it was as though the entire world had come to a sudden, irreversible end, and that somehow Ernest and Bartholomew had been transported to a cold and very distant place. And then a sound. A terrifying, echoing sound. "Bartholomew!" Ernest shouted. "What on earth was that?" "I'm so dreadfully sorry," Bartholomew replied awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I think it's most probably those prunes." What was it, Ernest wondered, after the pair had found their way back along the tunnels and emerged onto the courtyard of the old infirmary, that you were reading aloud back there? That incantation business? Ah, well, it was something written on those papers, a sort of in-case-of-emergency type thingamajig, as I understood it. I've packed them all away now, but it was a translation all to do with Anubis, one of those Egyptian fellows, the one with the head of a jackal, I believe, ordering the bad spirits away. Ernest nodded, smiling as he said, "Well, that really was jolly good and quick thinking, augmented by a not inconsiderable amount of sprit and bravery. I must say, well done, Mr. Jackson. Very well done indeed." He slapped Bartholomew roundly on the back, and the young man, feeling very proud and gratified, at last began to sense that he had now been accepted as a fully-fledged member of the CPI. "What do you think they would have used the curse for?" Dorothy asked, squeezing Bartholomew's arm in congratulation. "I really wouldn't like to speculate," Ernest replied, brushing cobwebs and dust from his trousers and examining his painful hands. "But I think it's a fair bet that it wouldn't have been anything with the village's best interests at heart. I did read in one of those notebooks something about ancient curses used for reclaiming the land, something in that vein. Perhaps Mr. Hedge had become enamored with the news of mummies and spells that's been all over the papers of late, and had developed some despicable plan to take over Potter's End. Although for what, I have no idea. I suppose the police will be able to get to the bottom of all that, once we pass over to them all this other evidence we've collected." Dorothy, having grown so concerned at their disappearance into the darkness, and frustrated at doing nothing other than sit and wait for them, had retrieved a hand torch from what was left of their equipment after Carl had packed the majority of it away in the CPI van and had then descended the stone steps. Once at the end of the tunnel, she had become fascinated by the collection of scientific apparatus and notebooks, as well as some astonishing artifacts she discovered inside the cardboard boxes. She immediately began making an inventory of the array of objects and, returning to the tunnel, those she found in cabinets and on shelves in other parts of the labyrinth. Through hidden doorways the others had missed, studying the maps of Egypt pasted onto walls as she went. She had, indeed, become so enthralled that she'd forgotten about the others, and felt it only right to apologize once again to Ernest for frightening him in the tunnels. "Oh no, my dear," he insisted, smiling bravely. "I wasn't the least bit worried." Still, there was something that bothered Ernest, something that had taken a hold of him and didn't let go for some considerable time afterwards. Although it remained unclear just how Mr. Hedge and his cronies had managed to not only import the sarcophagi and all the other vestiges into the country, and how they had then managed to get them so far below ground, through such narrow tunnels and into the basement below the infirmary, that was not the main cause of his disquiet. Not only had the mysterious miasma seemed to appear without any scientific experimentation of their own, but amongst the notes he had found, there had been receipts for and descriptions of several other ancient Egyptian artifacts. The list, which had also escaped Dorothy's investigations, included scarabs, amulets, chalices, jars and sculptures, and of grave concern to Ernest, they were described as being cursed and extremely potent. As they looked around, once Bartholomew has neutralized the initial threat of the gathering smog, they had encountered several other securely locked doors and arched passages that were completely impassable, so perhaps some of these more disturbing items were hidden there, although all attempts to make entry had proved uncannily futile. They would, he knew, have to keep very keen eyes out for the items, being sure to anticipate their reappearance should they somehow be retrieved at some point, and then intercept their transportation at the earliest opportunity. Therefore, the matter of Potter's End Infirmary was not, he feared, over just yet. The CPI retains copies of the documents subsequently passed on to the local police constabulary at Potter's End and, to this date, there has been no further information with regard to the location of the missing artifacts. Mr. Hedge has resolutely refused to comment on the topic, and so, as it stands, this particular case remains open. The CPI continues its vigilance,